Yeah, we are recording.
Okay.
All right. So, Ram, today we've kind of teased that we were going to talk about this for weeks now, but we're going to talk about burnout. I think it's a good conversation for us to have as we've been doing this extra thing. Like, I mean, we talk a lot about it not being a hustle, but the truth of the matter is that it is an extra thing. It's another thing on top of family and work and all of our other responsibilities. And we've shipped one product, and we have a couple of others that are just really close. So I wanted to, maybe as we're coming to the end of our first season of the podcast, and talk about burnout just generally, but also as a way to check in on where we are on doing this thing. So I sort of wanted to hand it off to you to talk about some of your experiences with burnout in the past and in the very recent present. I know we haven't talked a little bit about like uh, what you're doing right now, but I know that burnout has a deep impact on that as well. So you want to tell us all a little bit about burnout and how it has impacted you?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that I want to put out there is today I'm not feeling burned out. So I'm in a good place. I took
That's
my
like the
kids.
best. That's the best place to start. I'm so excited about that.
Yeah, because we both know that I was there not too long ago.
Yeah.
Um, I took my kids to school. I took my son to school this morning, my little one. It's such a good feeling. Got out the door, the weather's kind of nice. It's not as hot as it used to be. I come
Yeah.
back, I've got my coffee right here in front of me. And it's just so quiet and peaceful. And of course it helps my my wife went to work this morning. So it's pretty quiet. I'm in a pretty great space right now. And but that wasn't the case not too long ago, I think, if you remember. I mean, I've talked about it. I did write a little something about my experience with burnout on
Yeah,
like
that's right. I
my
forgot.
personal
There's a
site.
blog. We should add
Yeah.
that to the notes, to the episode notes for sure.
Yeah, so I wrote something about it because I mean that's how badly it affected me. I think, sometimes we get to a point to where it's like, this thing is on my mind, I have to write about it. And a lot of times if you get
Hmm.
to that point, it's pretty important. It's affecting you. And so in the recent past, okay, so just to, depending on when this comes out, today is uh we're like in September. I always lose track of the days. We're about mid-September.
Yeah, it's mid-September.
And probably about May, April, May. No, you know what? This just goes to show how long burnout affects you.
Hmm.
So it's probably started about the beginning of the year, I would say, maybe even late 2021. And burnout stayed with me for a long time to where I can't even remember or like narrow down the time that it affected me or the period that it affected me over. But my personal experience with burnout was feeling just like, I didn't want to go to work, feeling like it was, kind of all for nothing. Just really dreading, and it's like the case of the Mondays times
Hmm.
100 times
Yeah.
100. It's every single day.
Yeah. It's the
Um,
case of the every work day.
exactly. And so it's okay, to have the case of the Monday sometimes, and even that could be an indicator that it's time to move on or it's time to find something else to do. But when you have a case of the Mondays every single day, and then even bleeds into your Saturday and Sunday if you're working a full-time job,
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
that's a problem, right?
Yeah.
And burnout, and I say this because burnout affects everybody differently. Um,
Right.
it it just my I didn't have any motivation to like do anything. I thought about quitting every single day. Every
Hmm.
single day. I
I
would
remember,
read.
man.
Yeah.
I remember. I mean, I remember the when we would get on calls together, and you would just tell me that like that there were no tickets that were going to get closed today. Like there's just
Yep.
you just didn't have the energy, and I totally respect that. I sort of want to ask you because I think it's different for everybody. What burns you out, Ram? Like what is the thing what is the like we've talked a lot about developer overhead and ergonomics and working when you work best. And when I think about burnout, I don't really think about it as a single event that's like boom and now I'm burnt out. I think about it a little
Right.
like sandpaper, right? It is the continuous friction, psychologically or organizationally, that just leads you to be honestly like to feel completely unempowered. That's the way that I think about burnout. And when you feel unempowered, a lot of us, especially folks that like yourself that are high ownership people, begin to think that they're the problem. And I think that's what leads to burnout. So I want to ask, like, what is the friction that it gets introduced into your day, your job, your week that that maybe and it's interesting if you know it or not, that maybe leads to you being burnout so that you can identify that early. Like what's the friction point you think?
I think you hit it all on the head there. So first, it's important to identify that I am a high ownership person. I want to own
Mm-hmm.
and have a certain level of autonomy with whatever I'm working on.
Yeah.
It was the same thing when we were working at Stored
Yeah.
together. It's if I'm given a task or I'm given so in our line of work, right? I work with code every single
Yeah.
day, and it's a code base, and it might be multiple code bases. If I'm working in a code base, I want to have ownership. I don't simply want to write code that somebody else has already dictated for me to write. I want to be able to be creative and make decisions and also decide when something needs to be updated or changed because maybe the previous pattern put into place was an anti-pattern or there it wasn't a pattern to begin with. It was just like throwing spaghetti at the wall.
Right.
And
Right.
so that's the first thing is I have to have ownership over the thing that I'm working with. I can't simply go do a job and say, "Hey, just it didn't matter if I was mopping the floor, right? If they said, "Hey, you've got to mop this floor." I remember way back to you remember when you were in the military, right? You sweep
Yeah.
sidewalks. You remember that?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Um, and we're the type of people that if you tell me to sweep a sidewalk, I'm not just going to take the broom and like, do a half-hearted effort or whatever. I'm going to say, how can I make this like the best looking sidewalk um, on this block? And that's just how I am. And so when it comes to code, when it comes to a product, I'm always looking at how can I make this better? How can I improve? How can I leave it better than the way I found it? And it's next to impossible for me to do that. And so I faced a couple companies that they were looking for an individual contributor, basically. Now, during the interviews, you don't always get that. During the interviews,
Right.
they'll tell you whatever. Hey, we're looking for somebody to come in here and help us with patterns and we're going to clean stuff up, right? They'll tell you all the things. But then when you get in there and you actually start writing code, it's okay, you know what? We just need you to do this one thing.
Mhm.
And the problem with that for me is if there's already spaghetti on the wall, you're asking me to throw more spaghetti on top of the existing spaghetti. And I can't do that. It's incredibly difficult for me. I don't want to
Yeah.
contribute to something like that.
I just want to tell a story here for the folks on the call so that they really understand this. And I'm going to talk about a product that we have never actually talked about on the call before, and that's Kingside. Something that I worked on a really long time ago, and I showed it to you, and you're like, "This is really cool." And so I shared the code with you, and I'm mostly telling this story so we all get a feeling for the kind of refactorer that you are, because
I think, yep.
I mean, I will be the first to admit that that was not the cleanest code I've ever written. Like it was pretty gnarly. And like 2 days later, I loved that like you pinged me and you're like, "Hey man, I just couldn't take it. I refactored all the Kingside code." Um, and this is like a pet project of mine that was just like I wrote it in 2 days or something, or I wrote it in longer than 2 days, but it was definitely not clean. But like that's the sense of ownership that you have is like I showed you this code because it was kind of interesting, and you're like, this is too gnarly. I have to clean this up. Like this is embarrassing for any, and I appreciate that you cleaned it up because it was really gnarly. But like that's what you're. I really want to like give our listeners, then our hearers, our listeners, this idea that you really do care. I even remember when we were working together and you went through and it was even the small stuff like that just makes life really easy, like imports order, like you went through the entire code base and updated all of the import orders so that it made sense and put lint rules in place to make it automatic for folks. And so like this is something that really really matters to you, and I know that it's not really an ignorable thing.
Right. And I know deep down that the order of imports doesn't make the code work better. Um, well, in some cases, you actually have to import something like a polyfill has to come later, right? But in most cases, the import order doesn't matter. It's not going to make the code work more efficiently. Um, And
No, but
so,
it makes the code read more efficiently. And I think
yeah,
that's like another part of burnout is when you constantly face a struggle of trying to understand the project that you're working on. And I think that this is a specific kind of burnout that lots of people face that makes them feel inadequate, because that's a really easy to place to say, well, everybody else gets this code, why don't I get it? And I must be the problem. But man, if there's a really gnarly mental model, like, because import orders aren't like, because stuff's just not clean, then it certainly can lead to burnout, because like every time you go in to do something, I mean, the other outcome there is that you end up having to touch 15 different things to do one small thing. Um,
yes,
and I know you,
that's an absolute perfect example is you end up having to touch more things than you should have to when the code is not structured um, very in a very modular way.
yeah,
I've seen it a bunch of times. I've had to do it myself, make changes in multiple places. Um, and really that's not what you want for code because you increase the risk, right?
yeah.
The more files that you have to change, the more risk to break in the code base. Now, you can have tests in place and all that jazz, but you can still break stuff. And so,
And we'll definitely, this is a topic that, as you know, I'm very passionate about. So I'm sure we'll get a whole podcast episode dedicated to
yeah.
it at some point.
But this all comes back to mental overhead. So if I'm summarizing what led to my burnout, the majority of my burnout, it's mental overhead and not being given the level of autonomy or ownership over that code base to be able to make the changes and reduce the mental overhead,
Yeah.
right? So when we were both at Stored, right? So Randy was basically my manager, director, architect at Stored, and we have an understanding. And so it's like, well, do what needs to be done, and
Hmm.
and ultimately that's better for everyone. It's better for me from 6 months from now. It's better for another developer 6 months from now because they're going to come in here and they're going to say, okay, all the code that I need to change is right here in this one file, not in 10 files.
Yeah.
If it's structured in a really modular way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll just as a kind of a point there, and as a way to think about like burnout, like did your wife ever mention, like, could she tell that you were burnt out, like that
I
you
think
were?
so. Yeah.
Yeah.
You
St
can, your spouses know, right? Your
yeah.
spouses, you live with them every day. And I know you're gonna talk about this in a second, but absolutely, if you're feeling it, other people, through, just because they know you, absolutely feel it as well.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that really stood out to me at the end of my time at Stored was Steph. Steph was actually the one that called it. And she was like, I don't think that you realize what the stress of the way you're feeling at your job is leaking out onto the family. Um, because we all get it that your job is like stressing out. And my burnout was different. It wasn't necessarily mental overhead. Um, it was, and I'm very reticent to make a metaphor here that doesn't align. Um, but it was the constant firefighting, like, I there were days I remember when I felt like I couldn't walk away from my desk because everything was on fire, and that is very related to what we were talking about just before this call. Um, and so, like, I think the two things that lead to burnout for me is that the well, we've talked about this before, like artificial stress. That is if there's actually no actual stress, but like the stress is artificial, that will burn me out pretty quick. And the other one is a lack of purpose. Like if I feel like the work is meaningless. I remember saying there were lots of concerns back when we worked together at USA that I was taking on too much, and like I was doing too much, and I was pretty busy during that time. But I would always tell my leadership team that I would burn out from a lack of purpose before I did overwork. Um, and so that would be the thing for them to focus on, is to make sure that the work is that I'm doing is purposeful and meaningful. And by and large it wasn't. That was good. Um,
I wanna jump in right quick. You
yeah.
mentioned like leadership and stuff. So I think one of our most avid listeners is Brett uh
Hmm.
from USA.
Right.
and given a lot of positive feedback, and I really appreciate how he's interacted with us on this podcast. And the this is just like a note for leadership, because I do feel like Brett is gonna call this out anyway. Is if you're in a position of leadership and you have people on your team that uh, are high ownership type of people, you, you have to let them. That's the truth. You have to let them have real ownership.
Yeah.
Meaning, if you're expecting somebody to own this code base and to work with it for the next couple of years, because the truth is, you don't want somebody to come in and work for you for 6 months because that's expensive. It's
Hmm.
expensive, the whole hiring process, and then the turnover, and you've got to hire someone else. So if you want somebody to work for you for years and you want somebody to own that code base, you have to give them that at least a little bit of autonomy. I'm not saying that they can change the code base 100% because that's unrealistic as well. But you have to say, hey, this is one of those types of people that wants to own this, and this is what they're proposing. So
Yeah.
again, I don't really agree that you should give a brand new developer coming in 100% freedom to alter things in any way that they want. But you can have these conversations and say, this is the way, in which we should go based on modern patterns, because patterns change over time. And so we say, hey, based on modern patterns, this is the way we should go. I think what we have in place works, absolutely. But to be very specific to my issues, look, this code is 1,000 lines long. It's 2,000 lines long.
Hmm.
That's unacceptable in my opinion. And I know it works. I'll acknowledge that. But it creates a certain amount of mental overhead that's unacceptable
Right.
for me and for the people coming behind me.
And I'll say that the other side of that is you're interviewing for like leadership positions. Like one of the questions that I very frequently ask is just what will I own? Like what is the scope of my responsibility, and what am I the bottom line for? Because I think understanding that is a good way for me to understand if like the toolkit that I bring to the table is valuable to the company. Like if they're looking for somebody to solve a real problem for the organization that isn't something that I have the capability or interest in solving, then I know I'm the wrong fit, and they know I'm the wrong fit too. So it's worth just having that conversation. Okay, like what am I coming in to steer here? Um, but I think that's really important. And so that kind of leads to the next question is like if you're in a leadership position, and I know you've done a lot of mentoring and coaching. I mean, you were the lead back when we worked together. So like how do you begin to identify burnout in other people and help them? And then yeah.
Yeah. Before I answer this question, I want to first say that that question is what will I own is an absolute genius question to ask during an interview. So, in the very beginning, I think when somebody's a junior engineer, you're really not going to have much ownership. But when you get to that mid to senior level, it's the perfect question to ask is what will I own? So I wanted to capture that. Second, identifying burnout. You can kind of see it in people's faces, right? Like even if we're on Zoom, you can take these social cues. A lot of times, maybe somebody used to be engaged and they're not as engaged anymore. I know it happens to me all the time. When I think about like one-on-ones,
Ram, you'll
if I'm ha
sometimes tell me when I get on a call, you look tired or you sound
exactly,
tired, man. And yeah.
it's exactly right. And so you can identify these things, even though we're not in person. I can still tell if Randy's having a bad day or a rough day. Um, you can just tell based on their normal disposition and how things are going. Now, if somebody's always, kind of in a down mood, then still that could still be burnout. But
Yeah.
if I know somebody and things are different now, and here's another thing too, is I love to write code. Everything that we're doing for Anvil, everything in Propeller and Rubber Duck, I love hammering out code. Like if I had my way, I would probably write thousands of lines of code a day because I'm writing in a way that allows me to just move fast. But imagine if I was writing quite a bit of code and you notice a big reduction in the code that I'm writing or the production.
Hmm.
I probably don't care as much about it as I used to. Maybe it's requiring a lot of mental overhead for me to do this one thing. And so that's one way that you could identify it in me. And I've seen it in other people too. You just kind of notice like what people enjoy and what people don't enjoy, and just asking them, hey, how are things going? Or leaving things open. You never want to say, is everything okay? I think Randy, this is something you taught me a while back, was asking more open-ended questions. Because
Hmm.
there's times where I'll get on and I'll just vent.
Yeah.
In the past, I'll vent with people at work, and I'll be like, I'm just venting, right? But if you open the door by asking open-ended questions, that's usually how you're going to find out, what's on people's minds and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think two things that you really hammered out, like, is I mean, great. And it's the first is just pay attention to the people you work with, right? Like watch for their cues and shifts in mood, and especially like consistent shifts in mood. Burnout's not something that happens all at once. But if you watch somebody at a downward trend, and then I think about a decrease in activity, not I'm not even going to say productivity, right, but inactivity. If somebody's beginning to disengage, that's a pretty
Yep.
clear sign that there's something going on. Even if it's not burnout, maybe it's just that the problems aren't interesting to them, but eventually that becomes burnout, right? Like that's definitely burnout for me, is when the problems just aren't interesting anymore. um but it also may just be time to move on. Like I'll say that I wasn't really burnt out as a teacher. I was definitely like, I mean, it was wearing on me, but I didn't leave teaching because I was burnt out. I left it because I could have died in that job,
Yeah.
like just working myself to the bone. But okay, so like those are great things to look for, Ram. And then maybe the last question I'll ask you is like, and I maybe it's a reflective like thing. The question is, how do you help folks that are in burnout? But I want to ask it a little differently, and I want to ask like, what would you like for somebody to be doing for you if they start to identify that you're burnt out a little bit, that would help you, like, I'm not going to use the word shake it, that doesn't sound right, but like to refocus or to recover.
Yeah, I think so if I'm approaching it as the person that's helping someone else, and this could go the other way too, and I'm saying this because this is probably something I would like to hear, is acknowledging that one of the reasons that they may feel burnt out is exactly what you said. They've lost interest in the work. Um, Not necessarily that they've, decided to slack off, but maybe they've lost interest, and that leads to burnout. And the also is talking about it openly, because you may be feeling something, but you have yet to recognize it as burnout. You might just say, "Oh, I'm in a funk. I've been in a
Mm-hmm.
funk for like the last 2 or 3 weeks." Well, maybe it's more than that, right? There's a lot going on. We've heard of like layoffs recently and things like that. So people are kind of like in different funks, but your funk might actually be something more serious, like burnout. And I say burnout is serious because it absolutely is. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned you mentioned you could have died as a teacher, right? Because this stress, it weighs on you, because you're going and you're doing something over and over and over again that you're kind of done doing. And
Mm-hmm.
so from an outsider, or from somebody identifying it in somebody else, you've got to just have those open conversations. And it's okay to say, hey, look, if you're burnt out, if you're ready to move on, I support you. Because
Mm-hmm.
the worst thing that a company can do is try to keep somebody there that has already mentally checked out. We've talked about
Absolutely.
this before. Yeah, we've talked about this before. It's like I've told it to you before, and I think you've told it to me before. Is that, you know what? I'm checked out, and I can't check back in.
Right.
And I feel like that's true. It's incredibly difficult to, once you've checked out mentally out of a job or out of a type of work, for you to check back in, because there's reasons that you checked out. Those reasons haven't gone away.
Yeah.
And it could simply be that you're just tired of doing that thing, that you've done that thing for long enough. I've talked about this in a previous episode. I have to do new things often.
Yeah.
And I love writing code, but because of the type of person I am, I can't see myself writing code in 2 to 5 years. I just
Yeah.
can't, because I'm going to burn out on code, not on a specific job, not on Anvil, not on Rubber Duck. I love these things, but I'm coming to the end of my coding journey. That's just the way I am.
Yeah.
And so for you, I would expect you to say, "Hey Ram, maybe it's time to move on, and it's okay. I don't need you to stay here and write code. We can find something else
Yeah.
more important or something that aligns with where you want to go.
Yeah, I think this is really important, and we're I know we're at time because I'm watching it very closely. But I want to end by saying, because this is such a great wrap back to where we first started this podcast and talking about growing people. And that's that, like, if you see somebody, if I see somebody burning out, right? If I see something burning out, I've got to create opportunity for them to grow them into a new space where they want to be, or I have to help them prepare to move on. um I've never really been the person when somebody comes to me and says, like, I think I'm thinking about interviewing outside of the company, where I'm like, oh no, don't do that. I'm like, cool, let me help. Like, let me help you with your resume. Let me make sure we're capturing all of the great experience that you got here. Because, like, if somebody knows that it's time for them to move on, it's time for them to move on, and maybe that's the best thing that we can do for their resume, is like support and grow people. And sometimes that growth means growing inside, and sometimes it means growing out of, um or growing into and growing out of. And so that's a great way to help with, especially the burnout that comes from redundancy and doing the same thing over and over again. Like, I know you and I are very much the kinds of people that want to move the big rocks and then move on.
Yep.
um, and I think that's important, to continue to find bigger rocks. But Graham, I do have to drop here. This is a really great conversation. I want to also end by saying that I am super glad that you're not feeling burnt out right now. Neither am I.
Yeah.
I'll tell you
Same.
that Project Anvil is a huge part of that, because I am so excited about how things are going and where they're going. And we'll get to talk more about that, I think, next time.
Yeah, I appreciate you organizing this, putting this on. I want to say one last thing to anybody that's
Sure.
listening is if you're feeling burnt out or you feel like you're in a funk, is definitely just talk to somebody, talk to the people around you because most likely they felt it at some point too.
Dang, talk to us. Shoot us an email or something. We're definitely happy to chat with folks that are burnt out. Thanks, man.